terrorism was not born in the 21st century, not even in the 20th. The history of fear as a political weapon is as old as civilizations themselves, and it all begins here, in an ancient city where violence was no longer just a crime, but a message. Jerusalem, year 66 after Christ. The Romans ruled the region with an iron fist, abusive taxes, soldiers on every corner, and a population divided between those who submitted and those who were ready to fight. Suddenly in the crowd, someone falls. A small curved dagger flashes for a second before disappearing under a cloak. The killer does not run. He blends into the throng as fear spreads like a shadow. That was the hallmark of the Sicarii. The Sicarii were part of the Zealot movement, and they believed that the only way to liberate Judea was through terror. They did not attack armies. They did not declare battles. They killed in public, in broad daylight, priests, leaders, and officials who collaborated with Rome. The crime was not the end, it was the means. What mattered was the spectacle, that everyone knew no one was safe if they were on the wrong side. Think about it for a moment. They were few men, poorly armed, facing the most powerful empire in the world. How could they challenge Rome? They did not need to destroy armies, only to generate fear. Fear destabilizes more than 1,000 swords, and that principle would be repeated again and again in the history of terrorism. Centuries later, in the mountains of Persia, another sect perfected the art of terror, the Hashshashin. Led by Hassan-i-Sabbah, they became famous for sending young fanatics to assassinate political and military leaders. What is fascinating is that their attacks were almost theatrical. They infiltrated castles, camps, or fortified cities and struck in front of everyone. Without fleeing, without hiding, the impact was not in the death of a man, but in the message. If they could reach this far, no one is safe. The West was so marked by these stories that the word assassin comes from them. And although much was exaggerated by crusaders and European chroniclers, the truth is that the Hashshashin built a reputation so feared that even great kings preferred to negotiate rather than risk their daggers. Imagine the psychological effect: an army of thousands paralyzed by the fear of a handful of men willing to die just to send a message. But terrorism did not always come from rebellious groups. History also shows us examples of state terrorism, and one of the clearest occurred during the French Revolution. In 1793, the people had overthrown the monarchy, proclaimed the Republic, and dreamed of a new order of freedom. But the revolution soon devoured itself. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, established the so-called Reign of Terror. Thousands were executed at the guillotine, and most shocking of all, it was no longer only nobles and kings, but also common citizens and revolutionaries considered too moderate. The message was unmistakable: obedience was imposed through fear. For the first time in modern history, an entire government institutionalized terror as policy, and the guillotine became not only a symbol of justice, but of propaganda. A reminder that the revolution was sustained in the blood of its enemies. The guillotine stood not just as an execution device, but as the centerpiece of a political theater designed to instill submission. Public squares turned into arenas of fear, where entire crowds witnessed the swift fall of the blade, each strike reinforcing the dominance of the revolutionary government. What began as a tool to protect the ideals of liberty and equality had transformed into a machinery of paranoia, where accusations spread like wildfire and no one, aristocrat or peasant, revolutionary or skeptic, was beyond suspicion. The 19th century would bring a decisive transformation. With the emergence of new ideologies and technological advances, terrorism became more lethal and more media-driven. Russian anarchists and nihilists believed that a single attack could change history. They called it propaganda by the deed. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 with a bomb thrown in St. Petersburg, showed that not even monarchs were safe. Dynamite, invented only a few decades earlier by Alfred Nobel, became the weapon of choice, small, easy to hide, and devastating. A single man could shake an empire. One of the most infamous examples came in 1893, when the Spanish anarchist Paul y Palas hurled a dynamite bomb at General Martínez Campos during a military parade in Barcelona. Although the general survived, the attack shocked the public and demonstrated how a handful of explosives, in the right place, could undermine the aura of power and invincibility surrounding governments and armies. In Paris, cafes and theaters became targets of explosions. These were not chosen at random. Cafes were the gathering places of the bourgeoisie, the politicians, and the intellectual class that anarchists blamed for sustaining an unjust social order. By striking in such spaces of leisure and culture, the attackers sought to demonstrate that privilege and comfort offered no protection from the violence of revolution, turning everyday venues of entertainment into symbols of vulnerability. In the United States in 1901, President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist. Suddenly, terrorism was no longer a matter of occupied peoples or sex in distant mountains. It was in the heart of modern capitals, amplified by newspapers that recounted every attack in detail. And here we reach a key point. The press became terrorism's best involuntary ally. What once was a rumor in a market now turned into international news. Fear was no longer limited to one city. It could travel kilometers in a matter of hours. Thus, terrorism was transformed into a global phenomenon. A local act could inspire entire movements in other countries. Fear became contagious. It was in the heart of modern capitals, amplified by newspapers that recounted every attack in detail. From the Sicarii in Judea to the Hashshashin in Persia, from the guillotine in Paris to the dynamite in St. Petersburg, the story of the origins of terrorism is the story of how fear went from being an improvised weapon to a sophisticated method of political propaganda. But this was only the first stage. The 20th century would take all this to a scale never seen before. Terrorism would no longer be a dagger in a square or a bomb in a cafe. It would be a spectacle broadcast live, with hijacked planes, paralyzed cities, and governments shaken before the cameras. The era of global terror was about to begin, and that is the story we will tell in the next episode. If you enjoy these stories and want to uncover how terror has shaped the course of humanity, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a single episode of this series.